and wrestlers alike in the skills of Greco-Roman wrestling. The tapes are also meant to be used with the printed USA Wrestling syllabus. I wish you the best as you pursue excellence in the great sport of Greco-Roman wrestling. The first section of this tape series will deal with basic skills. These are not the 7 basic skills that we're all familiar with, but rather these are basic skills that apply directly to Greco-Roman wrestling. Also included in this section will be some of the basic body attacks in Greco, as well as some of the basic finishes. We're going to take a look at position on the feet for Greco-Roman wrestling, also referred to as stance. First thing we want to do is we want to establish a good foot base, about shoulder width apart, maybe a little bit more. The weight should be distributed slightly on the balls of the feet, so the knees are going to come forward just a bit, makes the heels a little bit light. Then the other thing we want to keep in mind is we want to keep the head up, the back straight, and the chest up. Now from here, elbows at the side, hands slightly forward, not extended. Then the last thing to complete the stance is this, the most important. You want to drop your hips to settle in here with a good solid low center of gravity. From a side angle it looks like this. If we contrast that with a freestyle stance would look more like this. The upper body torso area is bent over, whereas in Greco the chest, back, and head are straight up. Let's take a look at that together, contrasted with the freestyle stance. First we have on the left a freestyle stance, square stance, and on the right a Greco stance. And then we'll look at a staggered stance. Notice the torso position of both wrestlers. And then from another angle we have a square stance and a staggered stance.
Let's look at position or stance in this example with Olympic and world champions Oleg Kucherenko of the unified team and Vincenzo Maenza of Italy in the blue. Notice how the stance shifts from square to staggered to square. Here's another example with Olympic medalists Denis Kozlowski of the USA and Hector Milan of Cuba.
The next skill we're going to look at is motion. We start with our good stance. Now as we move, there's several ways we can move. We can move forward, we can move backwards, we can move laterally, we can circle this way, circle back and away. One of the important things to remember as you move is that you should always maintain a good wide shoulder width foot base. You want to avoid motions that bring you here, That's just basic common sense wrestling. The second thing is it's very important to work with your legs when you do your motion. The legs can't be lazy, you can't straighten up, this type of thing. Stay in a good stance, work with your legs. shuffle, move, back and forth. Another very important principle that you want to keep in mind, this is the same in freestyle, Greco, college style, the principle of shoulder, knee, toe. If you're coaching and you're looking at a wrestler and he violates that position here, he's out of position, he's off balance, you want to make sure shoulder, knee, toe is in line. If this is staggered, you've got shoulder, knee, toe here. There's always a solid base, good low center of gravity that the wrestler can come in and out of. Let's take a look at 3 different drills that you can use with your athletes to develop good motion and good movement. First drill we're going to take a look at is a motion drill without a partner. The wrestler's going to get in a good position. He's going to start to move his legs. Again, very important to move the legs. Coaches, as your wrestlers are doing this, make sure they don't violate the shoulders, knee, toe principle. This is a very good drill because it develops endurance down in that low position. Young wrestlers want to come up and straighten out their legs, but this is a good way to, for endurance to be developed. Then as they do that later on, you can add their own attacks, arm drags, duck unders, make it almost like shadow wrestling out of their good position and movement. All right, the next drill we're going to take a look at then is a partner drill. Both wrestlers are going to start with their hands behind their back. They're going to drop their hips and get in a good position, make contact. And they're just going to start to push and move and try to maintain contact the whole time they do this. Again, for this drill, very important, the shoulder, knee, toe principle. And we'll take a look at an example of the wrestlers getting out of position. They tend to lean. There's a tendency to lean on the other person's body weight. That's a bad position. Correct that. Make sure the wrestlers bring their hips in and move and work with those legs to maintain good position. Now, the third drill we're going to take a look at is another partner drill. This time, one of the wrestlers is going to have his hands behind his back. He's going to get in a good position. The other wrestler will make contact. And he's going to try to take his partner out of position by pushing and pulling. The object now for the driller with his hands behind the back is to keep those hips coming up. Again, it forces the wrestler to work with his legs and maintain good position. Now let's see an example of poor position. The wrestler gets his head snapped down, taken to the mat. So the offensive driller should be trying to work for a snap down or trying to work for some kind of a move that takes his partner off his feet and out of his position.
As we watch 1993 world champion Raul Martinez of Cuba in the blue against his Romanian opponent, we see examples of all of these types of motion.
The next skill is contact. When we look at contact, Greco-Roman wrestling is very much a contact sport. The officials will constantly encourage contact. Separation is interpreted as being passive. Compared to freestyle, where wrestlers more often than not tend to wrestle from more of an open style and can get away with a little more of that than in Greco. So a couple key things in contact. First of all, when you make contact, you want to avoid reaching. You should rather bring your body to your opponent's body, hands out and alert, and then make contact with your hands here. Also, some wrestlers prefer to do this even before they make contact with the hands. They'll bring their shoulder in, make contact here, then contact with the hands. But the idea is the same as you bring your body to your opponent's body. Avoid reaching and extending yourself. Another common mistake when wrestlers make contact is this. They'll make contact. Once they make contact, they'll let themselves get out of position, and they'll use their opponent's body as a post, and they'll get themselves extended in their contact. You must maintain good position also in a close, tight position.
Here are several examples of contact from the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona.
Once again, I'd like to emphasize the point, when you make contact, rather than reaching with your arms, maintain short arms, move your body to your opponent, and then also the purpose of this is to work to secure some type of a tie. So you want to work with your arms as you make contact to secure some type of a tie. The next topic we're going to take a look at is the tie-up, and there are many different types of tie-ups. We're just going to look at a few basic ones. The first one we're going to look at is wrist control.
Let's look at some live examples of this wrist tie. In this example, 1993 world champion Sergei Martinov uses a wrist tie to set up an arm drag.
And the next one is a 2-on-1, very common tie-up. 2-on-1 with an under grab. We're going to look at a 2-on-1 with an over grab. And we'll look at that from another angle. One other thing to point out here, notice the right arm or the upper arm is pulling the elbow to the blue wrestler's body. That's a very important concept, the pulling of the tie, keeping the hips in.
Olympic champion Oleg Kucherenko moves from an underhook to secure an undergrab 2-on-1. Notice his pressure and hip position. Here we see Sergei Martinov secure an undergrab 2-on-1. Notice his hip position and pressure. Olympic and world champion Islam Deguchiev secures an overgrab 2-on-1 and uses it to post his opponent to the mat for the takedown. Here we see world and Olympic champion Mike Bowman secure an overgrab 2-on-1 with which he sets up his reach-around waist tackle.
The next one we're going to look at is an underhook. Underhook position. Now the basic position for the underhook there is very good. The hips are in. The underhook is being pulled high. Hips in and pull. And I'd like to just contrast that for a minute with the hips back, pushing, and driving in. That's a dangerous position, common position in freestyle and college style, but dangerous for Greco. It opens up their athlete to a lot of different types of throws. So control the tie with the pulling motion. If you want to move forward with the hips in. That's a real good position right there.
Look at Oleg Kucherenko's body position as he secures this underhook. Olympic silver medalist Alfred Termakian uses an underhook to set up this throw-by takedown.
And then the next off of that, we're going to look at a double underhook position. Principles are the same. Pull the tie up, or pull the lock high. Keep the hips in. Again, we'll contrast that with hips back, pushing and driving into the wrestler. Again, the red wrestler there is putting himself at risk a little bit. So back to good position, hips in, pull the tie. If he wants to move forward, he moves forward by moving forward with his hips.
Two-time Olympic gold medalist John Ronigan of Norway secures a double underhook on USA's Sean Sheldon. Look at his great position as he finishes it with his power twist for the takedown. USA's Buddy Lee steps in for a high dive as his opponent, Sergei Martinov, catches him in this double underhook. Notice the great outside penetration step as he elevates him for this great to-the-back finish. Once again at normal speed. Let's look at what happens when you're out of position on this underhook. Red is digging for an underhook, but his poor position allows his opponent to set up this arm throw.
Then the last tie we're going to look at is a pinch headlock, another real common tie-up in Greco-Roman wrestling. Key thing here, again, the principles are the same. Hips are in, pull with the tie. The inside elbow on the collar, you want to keep that elbow in tight on your opponent's chest compared to having the elbow up and high. That gives his opponent a chance to counterattack and relock.
Let's look at an example of this with Olympic champion Oleg Kucherenko of Russia. As he secures an underhook, he elevates it. Look at the great body position as he secures the pinch headlock and finishes it with this pinch headlock throw.
Next, we're going to talk about pummeling. Pummeling in Greco-Roman wrestling is a very important concept, also a concept that has been somewhat misunderstood. And we'll start out by defining pummeling as the process of fighting for a dominant control position with the purpose of scoring an offensive technique. To demonstrate, I'll bring my partner out here, and we'll just take a look at, first off, the common idea of pummeling is this. Both wrestlers are in and out, digging for underhooks, but as you can see, with that type of a pummel drill, neither wrestler is establishing dominant position. Now, if we do this drill and use this little method or technique to dig for an underhook and control an underhook and prevent our opponent from pummeling in, then that's a good technique because I've pummeled into a position where I've established dominant control with my underhook. Pummel back the other side, dominant control to a double underhook, which has made my pummeling count for a purpose. The other thing, when we look at pummeling for a purpose for dominant control, we want to not only control the tie-up position, but we also want to control with our hip position and also with our knee position. As you can see, my hip and legs here, I'm also making my opponent very uncomfortable because I'm not only controlling this, but I'm controlling the space here. Outside position, also inside position here. You can see again I've established dominant position here with my leg and also dominant position here with my tie-up. This process of pummeling, it's important to know different ways to clear ties. For instance, a 2-on-1 tie, if my opponent takes a 2-on-1 tie, he's established dominant position. He's pummeled here. He's ready to execute an offensive technique. He's putting me on the defensive. I need to do something to reverse this situation. Nice, clean, easy little technique. I'm going to pull my arm tight, trapping this arm. I'm going to go to the elbow, pull the elbow high, straighten out my arm, dig back underneath to an underhook position. So now I've pummeled back into an underhook out of a 2-on-1 position.
We have a good example of this from our last example of the pinch headlock. Red has secured the 2-on-1 on blue. Blue controls Red's elbow, moving his body carefully until he can reach into position for the underhook. Once secured, he drives the underhook high, pinch headlock, completes it with the throw.
Another position that's very important to learn how to wrestle out of or to pummel out of is an underhook position. If my opponent's controlling the underhook, from here, I'm going to bring my elbow down. I want to circle back just a little bit, create space, bring my arm back over the top, pummel back in.
Here in the final match of the 1992 Olympics between Hector Milan of Cuba and Dennis Kozlowski of the United States, we see a great example of an individual trying to fight for dominant control with this underhook, preventing the other opponent from getting one and yet trying to secure an underhook of your own. In this example of pummeling for dominant control, both opponents have secured an underhook. Blue circles away, clearing the underhook on his side so that he can drive back in to secure another one of his own for a double underhook. Steps in, uses a power twist for the takedown.
Same thing goes for a double underhook position. Again, I'm being controlled. I'm going to settle my hip back, pinch my arms here, circle, create a little bit of space, pummel back in, back to more of a dominant position. Now from the underhook or the double underhook position, if I try this technique where I circle my hips and try to pummel in and he stays tight, I need to try something different. Another way is this, reaching up to the head, pull the head, also blocking, trapping the knee a little bit. Now I've created the space I need to be able to pummel back in and clear my arm. Those are just a few ways to change positions, to fight back to a dominant control position. But once again, pummeling is the process of fighting for a dominant control position. A live action pummel drill is an excellent way for athletes to develop their pummel skills. You can do any time limit on this you'd like, and you can establish any purpose in any guideline. Like, for instance, your purpose for the day might be just to dig for the double underhook position. A 5-minute pummel match, the wrestler who gets to the double unders the most often wins the pummel match. There was 1 point for red, they continue to pummel, there's 1 point for blue, and so on and so forth. The purpose for the day might be to control the 2-on-1, pummeling for the 2-on-1, establish dominance, and that's 1 point blue. They come back, they wrestle more, there's 1 point red, and so on and so forth. The next skill we're going to take a look at is off-balancing. Off-balancing is another very important concept in Greco-Roman wrestling. The purpose of off-balancing is threefold. One, off-balancing for the direct score, off-balancing for the purpose of setting up an offensive score, and off-balancing for the purpose of establishing dominance on the feet. So we're going to take a look at a couple important things in off-balancing. First of all, one concept that you want to communicate in off-balancing is the concept of creating pressure and then reversing that pressure. Without pressure, it's very hard for me to off-balance and take my opponent out of position. But if I can make contact and if I can push, and now the idea of pushing also is pushing under control, and it goes back to basic position. If I'm here leaning, I'm pushing out of control, and my opponent can snap and off-balance me. So when you push and make contact, this leg goes forward, hip position solid, I'm controlling my tie, I'm pushing. As I push, I create pressure, and then very simply I can reverse that pressure to off-balance my opponent. Pressure, reverse the pressure, pressure, reverse the pressure. A couple little drills, position drills that you can use with your athletes to help them learn to off-balance their opponent are these. Again, this very simple one, a 2-on-1, pressure, create pressure, push, 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 change it up, step back, pull their opponent to the mat. Bicep collar tie, again, keeping that elbow tight, pressure, push, push, create pressure, snap down, off balance. Under-over position is a very common position. Now from this position, again, maintaining good position with the feet, pushing forward a little bit, pressure here, and then off balance back to the side. So we went from the first two attacks, pressure in, pull back. Now this is a little bit different in that we're pulling sideways and then pulling back sideways again here to take our opponent off balance. Another little way you can off balance your opponent, will use a head and arm attack or a collar arm attack. Going to control a head and an arm here and just backpedal and circle, take my opponent right off his feet, right to the mat. And along the same line, from the same position, we're going to start with that kind of pressure here. He resists back. I've created pressure this way. I'm going to come right back to off-balance my opponent this way. All these examples, you can see the concept of create pressure one way, snap back the opposite way.
Let's look at several good examples of this off-balancing or change of direction technique.
Again, we can use a live action drill any period of time to help the wrestlers develop the ability to off-balance their opponent. Again, in this drill, the object is to take their opponent all the way to the mat. Every time they get a snap down or an off-balance where their opponent goes to the mat, the wrestler gets 1 point. You go for 5 minutes and keep score. Again, just to key in on the ability to develop the off-balance technique. The next basic skill we're going to take a look at is the penetration step. And we're going to look at 2 penetration steps that apply directly to Greco-Roman wrestling. The first one is an inside step penetration step that leads to a high dive. And here's a demonstration of that step. Now notice as the athlete does this penetration step, the differences. Once he steps, leads, penetrates, follows up, plants, locks and lifts backwards and changes his direction. If we contrast that with the freestyle inside step penetration, we see the athlete driving in and through his opponent. Back to the Greco-Roman high dive penetration step. Now we can drill this with the partner. We'll bring the partner in, and the partner will just present his body, and the driller will step, lock, and lift. You can see how that applies directly to a high dive or any type of a body attack in Greco-Roman wrestling. Very common.
Here's a variety of looks at this inside penetration step. Notice that sometimes this inside penetration is achieved as much by a drop step of the opposite leg as it is by a step forward by the strategic placement of the leg to begin with.
The second penetration step we're going to take a look at is an outside step penetration. This is very common in most body attacks in Greco-Roman wrestling. It's common in a duck under, reach arounds, arm drags. We see this penetration step here without a partner. Step outside and then turns the corner, makes a 90-degree angle. And now we'll look at that with the training partner. Again, the training partner presents himself. We just drill step to the outside. Very important that the athlete turns the corner on this. Turns the corner, goes behind, locks and secures the hip. Very effective, very important penetration step in Greco-Roman wrestling.
Let's look at some examples of this outside penetration. Notice in all of these that the placement of this outside foot or outside leg is essential to the proper turning of the corner to finish the technique.
Here are some very common body attacks in Greco-Roman wrestling. We're going to start around with a very simple reach-around attack, very high percentage, very simple technique. Starting from a 2-on-1, the athlete is going to reach around with an outside penetration step, and then turn the corner, secure the hip. Very effective, very clean technique. And the next technique we're going to look at is an arm drag. We're going to start from more of an open tie with an outside penetration step with an arm drag. Let's take a look at an arm drag with an inside step. Inside step. Following it up in a belly-to-belly position rather than a belly-to-back position. And the next common body attack we're going to look at is a duck under. And there's a duck under out of a bicep tie. I look at a duck under out of a common pummel attack. Wrestlers are digging for underhook position. The duck under comes out of that quite nicely.
Notice that the level change in this duck under is accomplished by dropping from the hips and knees, not by bending over, which would put you out of position.
And the next attack is similar to a duck under. It's a slide-by attack. Again, from an over-underhook tie. Wrestler's going to do a slide-by with an outside penetration step, then turns the corner, finishes in a belly-to-back position. Important once the athlete turns the corner to secure the hip with a tight lock. Again, if you can, get that opponent up in the air, take him to the mat, talk about finishes later. And the last body attack we'll look at is a high dive attack, another high percentage technique. From a 2-on-1, we see a nice inside step high dive attack. From a 2-on-1 the other side, do the same thing. look at common body attacks, and I think now is an appropriate time to talk about centering, which is another very important concept in Greco-Roman wrestling. Centering has been likened to a sprawl in freestyle, and we refer to centering as the Greco sprawl. Let me just show you an example of what I'm talking about. In all of the body attacks that we just saw, the attacker, it's important for him to control the hip. On a reach-around body attack, if he can control the hip, turn the corner and lock me up, he's beaten me, and he's going to score. Centering is this little idea right here. He reaches. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drop my hip, center it back and away, and square up. So, again, if we liken it to a freestyle attack to the legs, if my opponent attacks my legs, I'm going to sprawl my leg back and adjust back to position. Since the main attack in Greco is not a leg attack but a body attack, I've got to sprawl something else back, and that something else is my hip. So once again, reach around attack, hips back and away. I'm going to recover back up to some kind of an attack control position. See the same thing on an arm drag attack. He attacks, he goes for the hip, center the hip back and away, circle, 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 fight right back into an underhook. You can do the same thing with the high dive, with the duck under, settling that hip back and away, struggling back to a good, solid base position. As a live action drill, you can drill with a partner. First start off with the offensive. He drills this, controls the hip, goes behind. Then maybe do that for 30 seconds. The next 30 seconds, it's time for me to drill my Greco sprawl. He does the reach around. I do my hip reaction, give him the arm. He does the hip reaction again, give him the arm, reach around, hip reaction again, just to develop that centering action.
Here are some examples of this centering or Greco sprawl technique.
The next area we're going to take a look at are common finishes from the body. This is the part that makes Greco-Roman a real exciting sport. We're going to look at the different finishes. There's a lot of, you can do these finishes out of a lot of different body attacks, but for purposes of the film, we're going to use one body attack per finish. We're going to do an arm drag body attack to a waist tackle. And the second finish from the body we're going to look at is a hip swing finish. We're going to use a high dive setup. And the next finish we're going to take a look at is a crackback finish, again with the high dive setup. Okay, the next finish we're going to look at is the throw-by finish. Again, we're going to set it up with a high dive attack. Okay, now let's take a look at a power twist with an arm drag body attack. Next is a belly to back from a reach around. And we'll take a look at a belly-to-belly finish, duck under to a belly-to-belly. As you can see, there's a lot of power and skill involved in these finishes from the body. So here's a couple drills you can do with your athletes to help them be real comfortable in a belly-to-belly position. The bridge has been referred to as the foundation of Greco-Roman wrestling. If we look at a direct application for the bridge, we can see it in many areas. Two of the key areas, though, one is in any type of a back arch throw. The other one is in a gut wrench. It's very important, and as we go through the bridge, that we teach our athletes to bridge correctly, and a couple principles that we want to lay down right from the very beginning. First of all, we want to have a good, solid foot base. The athlete's heels are fairly close to his butt, not extended out here, but we want to pull them up fairly tight to the butt, flat-footed, as you can see. When we start the bridge and start to make the bridge, a basic principle that you want to follow is that the knee should not go in front of the toe. You want the knee above the toe, and then we're going to make the bridge by pushing up and back, so the angle of the knee should go from here back up to here. And as the athlete goes up into his bridge, he made the bridge by pushing with his feet, pushing with the thighs and hips up into his bridge. Now, to teach the athlete to bridge correctly and in a way that applies to specific technique, we want to constantly emphasize the hip and the thigh push right here. So we're going to come down, touch the shoulders to the mat. I'm going to have the athlete touch his shoulders to the mat, elevate his hips right there. Now, to make the bridge, he's going to push up using his thighs and hips. Push up, come back, touch the shoulders, keep the hips elevated. Now, if they have problems in this position, they can use their hands to steady themselves on the mat. Push, touch, push, touch. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to have them put their hands on the mat and make the bridge by pushing up with their hands. We want to teach the wrestler to use his thighs and hips out of a bridge position. This is where the power comes from. Push, touch, shoulders, push.
Here's an example of the bridge as used in the gut wrench technique.
And here are a couple drills to help your athletes develop a good, strong bridge. A flip-flop drill. And another drill is running the pike. If your wrestler's having a difficult time doing the flip-flops, you can gradually work him into it by putting him up against the wall. And when he gets comfortable with a certain level on the wall, he can move his head away a little bit more. And practice, and then move it away a little bit more. His feet go down closer to the floor, a little bit more. And a little bit more. Until your wrestler's ready to do the flip-flop all by himself. Next, we're going to take a look at a back arch, and in emphasizing the back arch, there's one point that we need to look at, and that's the momentum of the back arch. Again, we're going to key in on the knees, and when the wrestler does his back arch, the knees should not go in front of the toes. The arch should be up and back compared to a down and forward motion. Common mistake when wrestlers start to do this back arch is they want to drop their knees forward. So we'll take a look at a good example, and then we'll take a look at a bad example. First of all, a good example of a back arch. Again, focus in on the knee position. Nice fluid arch. The wrestler's going to come back up. I'd like to make one other point. As the wrestler starts his back arch position, notice how he lowers his hips a little bit and then extends the hips, goes up into the back arch. Knee position's real good. It's a fluid motion. Now we'll take a look at an example of what happens when the wrestler's force is down and forward. Watch the knee position. As you can see, the momentum goes forward, and as he goes into his back arch, he stalls a little bit. It's not a real fluid motion. One more bad example, and then we'll come back to a good example. Again, focus in on the knee position. Here are some drills for developing the back arch throw. First one is a partner drill, where one partner holds his partner's hands to give him a little bit of confidence. Here we have an example of this part of the skill being mastered. I'd like to use this opportunity also to take a look at what happens when a wrestler's not ready to go on to the next step. It's important that the wrestler goes all the way through with this and do a full back arch. If he pulls his head, flattens his head, or flattens his back, it could be a dangerous sign that he's not ready to go on to the next step. So coaches make sure that they master each skill before they go on. There we have a good one. Now he's ready for the next step. He's going to try it on his own, but his partner is going to spot him on the lower part of his back. Notice too that when the back archer is drilling, he uses his hands to take up some of the impact from his head. One other thing that needs to be mentioned, again, the importance of going all the way through with this, there's a counterbalance that takes place as the hips go up and the head goes down. There's a counterbalance that makes landing on the head very painless and very smooth motion. All right, now the wrestler's ready for the next step. He's going to use a crash pad. Again, using his hands without a spotter, going into the crash pad to a nice arch. And when he's comfortable with that and has mastered that, he's ready to do it all by himself on the mat. Now we're going to take a look at the back step. The back step is a penetration step that we use to do back step throws. There's several different types of throws that we use out of a back step, and we'll look at those in detail later. But for right now, we're just going to focus in on the skill of the back step. Again, back step is a penetration step. We want to start with a good stance and good position. Again, we lower the hips. We're going to start and step and penetrate like a regular penetration step, and as we do that, notice that the hips are still low, so we have a level change involved here. This level change should be maintained throughout the entire back step. Come back to stance, hips are low, step and penetrate, we've got a level change. Now the next step is this. We start in our stance, step and penetrate. Now we're going to bring our back leg and bring our toe to our heel. We're actually going to cross over. There's not many times in wrestling where you cross over. This is one of them. Low, step and penetrate, toe to heel. Low, step and penetrate, toe to heel. Now, the next step is the pivot, and when we do the pivot, there's two things we want to keep in mind. One is when we pivot, we want to pivot on the balls of our feet, not flat-footed. We've got to be able to make that turn. The next thing is that we're going to make a 180-degree turn, so I start out penetrating towards that wall. When I'm done, I'm going to be facing that wall. And then the last thing we want to key in on with the pivot is the power. If we think of a hockey player throwing a hip check, when we do this pivot, we want to throw our hips through, and that momentum from the hips is going to cause us to be able to spin and pivot all the way through. So here's how it looks when we put it together. Low stance, step and penetrate, level change, toe to heel, hip pivot. Now, there's one other point that we need to talk about. Notice after the hip pivot or the back step is done, that my weight is on the balls of my feet and I'm slightly leaning forward. This is the correct position. You want the weight going forward, step, toe to heel, pivot, slightly going forward compared to this. Step, pivot. And again, when we do our throws, we'll see that that position, this position right here, this coiled, loaded position is very important in order to execute a powerful back step throw. Okay, now we're going to look at a hip hop, and again, we're going to look at hip hops more in detail when we start to do throws, because really the hip hop is the dynamic in the heart of all throws. That's where the power comes from. But for drilling purposes and basic skill purposes, it's very important. We'll look at hip hop from two different positions. First, from a body lock position. My partner's going to bring his feet together, hand at his side, and he's just going to present himself here. I'm going to come up and take a position with my hips in. I'm going to drop, lock, and here's the hip hop. Up. Again, a hip hop's an explosive motion. What you want to try to do is you want to try to bounce his hips right off your hips, and if you can see an explosive pop, the wrestler's probably doing it correct. We can compare a hip pop to a hip lift, and you can see the difference. A hip pop is not an easy lift. This is a lift. A hip pop is explosive, drop lock, pop. And again, you can probably judge the power of the hip pop by how much the partner's hips come off of the hip popper's hips.
This hip pop to a high arch finish from his duck under won a gold medal for Attila Repka from Hungary in the 1992 Olympics.
Okay, now we'll take a look at a hip hop from a back step position. Same thing, we're going to step here, back step in, and just an explosive punch from this coiled position. Now again, look for that explosive pop. That's the key. Again, here's an example of just a hip lift. Same position, here, that slow lift. We want to do an explosive, powerful hip hop. Pop. All right, the next skill area we're going to look at are grips. Grips are very important, often not paid much attention to. But the first grip we're going to look at that's very important for Greco-Roman wrestling is simply a knuckle lock grip. Clasp the knuckles here. This grip of all grips allows for the most extension and the most mobility. You can tighten this grip up by pinching the elbows and pulling in tight with the arms. You can make it loose and long when you need leverage. And there's many, many areas that this type of a grip is very important, and the ability to go tight, to loosen it up, to go tight. And we'll talk more about that in detail later as we get into certain techniques. But one other thing about this grip is many young wrestlers don't like this grip because it feels very uncomfortable for them, but they're limited if they don't learn to use this. It takes away, again, their mobility and potential for learning some important advanced techniques. The second grip would be a hand clasp grip, which again allows for a fair amount of extension, not quite as much as this, but a fair amount. Harder to change up, but in certain cases, very important. Then we'll take to a butterfly grip, where we're going to take and actually cup the forearms here. Again, this grip, we see this in gut wrenches quite often. When we need a tight, secure lock, when we know that we don't need to extend and change our grip very often, we know we're going to get a tight grip, we need to keep it tight, very secure. Again, with this grip and with all grips, when it's time to tighten them up, pinching the elbows and pulling tight here makes that space even tighter and smaller. So those are the three basic grips that we'll key in on here out in Greco-Roman wrestling.